Well, hello, everybody. Welcome again to another exciting lecture with your favorite speaker, Dr. Ronald J. Brown. Our topic for today is a fascinating topic. It is Santa Muerta, or Holy Death. Sometimes it's translated as Saint Death. This is a very popular Mexican folk tradition. And it is designed to enable the Mexicans to deal with death. Now, death is an extremely important part of Mexican history, and not just traffic accidents like we have in the United States or the usual schedule of school massacres. In Mexico, death has been present from the arrival of the Spanish, when millions of Mexicans were killed by disease and warfare. And even before that, with the Aztecs, their mass human sacrifice, sometimes thousands of people sacrificed on one special holiday or occasion. So the Santa Muerta enabled the Mexicans to deal with mass death. And it enables them until today to deal with a mass death from COVID-19. And as I speak, monkeypox is popping up all over the place, and who knows what the next pandemic will bring. Well, the Mexicans have been well prepared to deal with death. So this is our outline for today: death in the age of COVID-19. This is not just a problem from Mexico, but the United States, which has had over 1 million deaths. Shocking because of our so-called excellent healthcare system, but yet we have been plagued and are still plagued with COVID deaths. Point 2, I will contrast the Western American and European attitude towards death and how they have dealt with death as opposed to how the Mexicans have confronted the COVID pandemic. Point 4 will be the daily presence of death in Mexico. Today, it's the drug cartels, gang wars, disease, crime. And then Nuestra Señora de la Santa Muerta to the rescue, Our Lady of a Holy Death. Point 6 will be how this folk cult, condemned by the Catholic Church and other civilized people, has really emerged from its ghettos of poor, downtrodden people and become a major religious movement. And point 7, not just a movement in Mexico, but in a way teaching the world that there are different ways of approaching death. Well, on the right is a picture of me in Mexico. This is in my hotel, and you see a bicycle, flowers all over, and a skeleton riding it. So death has been a major issue in Mexican history. The picture is El Dia de los Muertos, which is what we call Halloween in the United States. Whereas in Mexico, it was believed that it was a time when the dead returned to mingle with the living. So let's get going on today's topic, Santa Muerta, the Mexican way of death. Well, I go to Mexico quite often. In fact, I was there in January 21, exactly 1 year after COVID began ravaging the world. Well, I went to Cancun as usual. I'd never been there before. Well, of course, all the hotels were totally evacuated. Nobody was there. No tourists were there. Cruise ships were incubators for COVID. And so Cancun was basically a dead tourist resort. Well, of course, I would never stay in one of these big luxury hotels on the ocean. I stayed at my little hostelito mexicano, or my little hostel. In the middle, you see the hostel. It's just basically a little house with a thatched roof and a little yard out in front. And you'd go in, you'd share a room with 3 or 4 people, or you could have a dormitory with a whole bunch of people. On the right is me at the front deck and the front door. Above me, you see where the lamp is hanging. That was a little balcony area with tables and chairs and books. And I'd get up there and sit and read. And there were a fascinating mixture of people at the hostelito. In fact, it was packed. I was lucky I had gone online and reserved my room early because the place was totally packed, the exact opposite of the grand hotels in the ocean side. Well, when I was there, it was a fascinating time because Mexico was still open to tourists. They didn't require very much. We have to realize that tourism is a major source of income for the country of Mexico. Well, who was stranded there? Well, the cruise ships were laying in the harbor. Nobody was on them. So all of the workers on these cruise ships basically had a vacation. I don't know whether it's paid or not, but of course, to save money, they were at the hostel. All of the people who taught snowboarding and skiing in the winter in Switzerland and came to Cancun for the summer season, water ski instructors, were unemployed. So they were at the hostelito. Bar and restaurant workers in the hotels and cruise ships who worked for tips were at the hostel unemployed. No construction was going on, so Mexican construction workers. Teachers like me, who had been forced to start working on Zoom, writers, accountants, and all these people were sitting at the table in the upper balcony every day. Dancers, artists, musicians, well, no orchestras were playing, the theaters were closed, and so there were dancers and artists and musicians who had been on vacation over Christmas and simply couldn't get back to Sweden, to Finland, to France, to Australia. Hotel, resort, store employees, online students, unemployed kids who had simply no jobs or were underemployed. There was one couple from Quebec, a husband who had had a stroke, and it would cost him so much to fly his body or his paralyzed body to Quebec and then to go into quarantine for 2 weeks at a very expensive hotel. They were literally stranded at the hostelito in Cancun. Australians were there. They couldn't get home. Australia was in lockdown. The flights, the very few flights that were still operating, would have forced them to pay over $10,000 to return, and then to be in quarantine in a hotel or something at their own expense. So these were the people who were stranded in Cancun. The statistic on the right shows leisure and hospitality, retail, trade, education, government workers, manufacturing professionals, construction, other services, and other industries. These were the people who simply couldn't go home, or there was nothing to go home to. And so they decided just to crash at the hostelito and other hostels in Cancun. I call these the COVID-19 refugees. Well, from my little hostelito, I went traveling and went to Zipolite on the Pacific coast, which once again was filled with people who were simply stranded. And once again, young people, older people who had nothing to go home to. Well, all these young people, of course, they hadn't been vaccinated because that didn't exist yet. And they decided, well, we're stranded here. Who knows what's going to happen? And of course, that nice bodybuilding guy and his girlfriend were convinced they were never going to catch COVID-19. So Mexico became a party country. Everybody going to the beach to watch the sunset over the Pacific, breaking into applause, and then literally all hell broke loose. It was party time in Cancun and Zipolite. No masks, no vaccinations, no way to go home, or nothing to go home to. So they just decided, as if it was the end of the world, enjoy your last days in Mexico. And of course, I was one of these, dancing all night, drinking, partying. Nobody had a mask. Nobody was worried about the future. Well, back home, whether it's Australia or whether it is United States or Canada or Britain, the mentality was not to accept COVID and live or die with it. But Western science had convinced everybody that science was the answer to everything. After all, we had invented penicillin, which overcame all of the infections and so many other diseases. Modern science was conquering hepatitis C, conquering cancer. Breast cancer was nothing to worry about. Prostate cancer was going to be shortly under control. And so in the West, they were coming up with ideas for vaccines, isolation, all kinds of programs. More than one quack doctor was on the television promising this would cure it, that would cure it. American science promised physical immortality. All diseases would be conquered. We were going to build the perfect city. We're going to clean up the air, overcome pollution, and everything would be fine. Well, the civilized world, as they say, all adopted their way of conquering death and disease. Lockdown in Britain, house arrest for those who violated it. Prime Minister, stay at home, this is a national emergency. In France, isolation, zone chaude. Certain Russian cities were simply shut down. India suspends flights and over the COVID-19 and its even more lethal mutations. In Germany, the beer bars and the discos were shut down. Everybody was fearful of going out. Saw people not only with masks, but with respirators and all kinds of ways to conquer this disease. Well, this is how the West was trying to deal with COVID. Lockdowns, masks, no open churches, synagogues, and temples. Well, of course, there were resistance. For example, Orthodox Jews in New York were convinced God would protect them. A lot of Christians said, well, our churches should be open. Schools should be open. In France, protests, no to the masks. Let our children smile. And so it was a big debate in the West. Those who simply chose to ignore COVID, like Donald Trump said, it's just another flu, it'll be gone in a couple of weeks. But the scientists were convinced it is a lethal disease and we can conquer it. So the scientists declared a virtual war against COVID. It was an enemy to be resisted, to be conquered. And it just wasn't the United States and Western Europe. but in India joined the war against COVID-19, India's war against the virus. And so many countries literally declared war on COVID, while everybody, and myself included, were partying in Mexico and ignoring it completely. In the West, science could conquer everything, and it would conquer everything. The immortal cell, one scientist's quest to solve the mystery of human aging. We could live forever. We were going to conquer cancer. We were going to end heart disease. And so the future of humanity, as in the bestseller by Michio Kaku, the future of humanity, terraforming Mars, opening up new planets to human colonization, interstellar travel, distance was simply something to be conquered and mastered. Immortality, we would live forever. The human body would never age, would never suffer from disease. This was the Western approach to dealing with COVID-19. Well, the Mexicans had developed over the centuries a totally different approach to death. Not that it's simply something that should be dealt with, accepted, but in the Mexican way of dying, death was necessary for new life to emerge. And when you visit the pyramids and the Aztec ruins, such as on the left, you'll see entire walls celebrating those who had been sacrificed to the various Aztec gods. On the right, you see a Spanish drawing depicting the surgery to open the chest of a victim, take out his still beating heart, and offer it to the ruling gods of the Aztec kingdom. Even the famous Mexican football game, which every city had its amphitheater, its stadium for the game. Well, what was the reward when you won the game? You won the right to be sacrificed to one of the Aztec gods. So death was not just something to be accepted, it was something to be celebrated. If you didn't celebrate, if you didn't sacrifice enough humans, maybe the sun would not rise tomorrow morning. Maybe the god of storms would come and devastate the country, destroy the agriculture. Maybe an enemy would invade and slaughter everybody. Maybe the rains would not come and people would die of starvation. So the way to keep society functioning, keep the crops growing, protect the kingdom from enemies, keep the sun rising, and ward off hurricanes coming from the Atlantic or the Pacific, the way was human sacrifice. And it was considered a great honor to give up your life, give up the life of one person, so that the civilization would continue. The goddess of death in Mexico, and I can't pronounce her name, but it is Mixtecoatl, is very present in all of the temples. Now, if you look closely, you see it's a rather fierce-looking woman with a crown of skulls. But in addition to the crown of skulls, between her open hands is a baby about to be born. So the goddess of death does not mark the end, although it does for many people, but it also marks a new beginning, a new life. So those football players who gave up their life for the Aztec kingdom were necessary to keep the kingdom strong. So they were giving up their life so that their brothers and their sisters and their parents and their descendants could live in a world without storms, without earthquakes and volcanoes, without famines and disease. So death was not something to be feared, although of course, you lamented losing your favorite son, but like soldiers in battle, you were considered a hero, and you were considered a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. Well, when the Spanish arrived in 1519, death became even more virulent. The Spanish brought a host of European diseases with them. And there, the diseases spread. Well, of course, the Spanish killed off probably tens of thousands of soldiers. They rounded up the native Mayan and Zapotec and Aztec and Mixtec peoples, forced them to become Catholic, and forced them to live on plantations where they were literally slave labor. Well, the Spanish, of course, killed off tens of thousands of soldiers, and this was the Conquista. Diego Rivera, the great mural painter of Mexico, commemorates this arrival of the Spanish, bringing not just conquest and bags of gold, as you see the guy at the right end of the picture counting his gold pieces from enslaving the Indians, but the Catholic priests and monks baptizing the people, the Catholic nuns forcing them into the Catholic Church. Well, in addition to conquest and forced conversion, the diseases of the Europeans spread like wildfire. Some people argue that the population of Mexico and Central America was reduced by a half to 3/4. The Mexicans and the Americans in general, from Alaska to Argentina, had lived in isolation, protected by 2 oceans. So when, for example, there would be an influenza epidemic which would sweep through Europe, it did not affect the Mexicans. Gradually, Europeans build up a degree of resistance to diseases like influenza, mumps, smallpox, measles, cholera, typhus, malaria, and many of them survived. Whereas when the Spanish soldiers arrived in South America, nobody had resistance to these diseases. Again, on the left, you see the soldiers conquering the Mexicans, but even those who survived were subjected to horrible plagues, as we see in the drawings on the right. So disease, warfare, genocide ended up massacring the Mexican population. Well, the death continued, whether it was crime, famous drug cartels, drug deaths, then came AIDS, dengue fever, and today, COVID-19. And as I speak, who knows, it might be monkeypox or another variant of COVID, continue to ravage the Mexican population. Well, the Aztec approach to death merged with the Catholic approach to death. The Mexicans, the Aztecs, had said, well, death is necessary for new life to emerge. Well, the Catholics had an interesting approach to death as well. Don't forget that the central ritual of the Catholic Mass is the death of Jesus, that Jesus went up to heaven. And what is the central ritual? Catholics drink the blood of Jesus and they eat his body. That's the communion, the Eucharist. And so you had two very different religious traditions merging. Now, this is called syncretism. Religions are constantly influencing one another, merging. Buddhism emerged from Hinduism and became its own separate religion, but yet maintained many aspects of Buddhism. When Constantine the Great, the first Roman emperor to become Christian in the 3rd century, when he made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, many elements of the Roman religion, the pagan Roman religions, simply merged with the new teachings of Jesus and gave rise to a Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church. They absorbed Greek philosophy. They absorbed Roman pagan beliefs. Islam as well was a merging of the various forms of Christianity and Judaism, which were prevailing in the Middle East. There were Christian and Jewish kingdoms in Arabia and Yemen. Prophet Muhammad had long intercourse with Jewish and Christian teachers and priests, and Islam, as it emerged, was in many ways a merging of Judaism, Christianity, and of Arab paganism. So again, new religion simply absorbs parts of old religions. You can't understand Judaism without its roots in Babylon. Abraham was from Babylon. The stories of Adam and Eve and Noah, the Tower of Babel, as in Babylon, were all taken from pagan Babylonian legends, incorporated into the Jewish Bible, and today are called the books of Moses. But they simply absorbed elements from Babylonian religion. Later on, they absorbed elements such as the Messiah and monotheism from Egypt and Babylon and Persia, just like Reformed Jews of today. Going to a Reformed synagogue, you could be in a Lutheran church. I mean, it is the central feature is the pulpit and the book with the organ in the background. So when Aztec cult of the death merged with Catholic cult of the death, a whole new religious movement emerged. Now, the Catholics were obsessed with death, not just in the Eucharist. You go into Catholic churches, you see a dead Jesus hanging on the cross. You see in many Spanish churches and Catholic churches in Europe, where you'll have an altar and inside it is the remains of a very holy person or a saint. Good Friday in Catholic countries is when people reenact the death and crucifixion of Jesus. Well, of course, for the Catholics, Jesus did not just die, and you just did not endure the Holy Week and the death of Jesus on Good Friday, but the very next big holiday is Easter Sunday, where from death came the resurrection. And it was necessary for Jesus to give his life to save humanity from sin. And so the Aztec temples with their skulls and human sacrifice all over the place was in many ways very similar to the Catholic cults of the death. Halloween, Day of the Dead, the picture at the bottom in the middle, you see a woman with a skeleton mask on, but yet totally decorated with flowers, saying death gives birth to new, glorious, wonderful life. Now, this mixing of religion, this syncretism, is very much part of world history. Voodoo in Haiti and New Orleans, the blending of African religions with the Catholicism of the Spanish and the French. The candomblé of Brazil, blending of African religions of the Yoruba people with the Catholicism of the Portuguese. African American spirituals, blending African religious traditions, forms of music and forms of worship with Protestant Christianity. Santuario in Cuba and the islands, again, the cult of the saints, blending with the many gods of Africa. So religions merge, religions grow, religions are changing. And if you don't grow and emerge and change, you will disappear. The Day of the Dead in Mexico, All Souls and All Saints Day. Well, it celebrates death, but coming from death is new life. Mardi Gras, the celebration of life before you go into the holiday of Lent and leading up to the death of Jesus. So religions merge, and especially in Mexico, where the majority of the people remained Aztec and Maya people, absorbed huge elements of Christianity and developed their own unique form of religion. The Day of the Dead, again, celebration of death, but from death comes new life. Altars, ofrendas in homes. Picture at the top on the left, you see a couple. Evidently, they had died in a car accident or something. And so they would put a shrine in their homes. They would decorate it with skeletons, with skulls, with other puppets dressed up in finery. Right in front of the picture of the man and the woman on the table surrounded by skulls is Our Lady of Holy Death, meaning good comes from death. Death is necessary that new life can be born. And so this is the Mexican tradition of death. It's not something to be feared. It is part of life. Embrace it, accept it. Don't try to run to the pharmacy and to get a pill to save yourself from death, because most Mexicans probably couldn't afford the pill anyways. So death is necessary for new life to emerge. Mexicans love cemeteries, where on the Day of the Dead they go and they believe that their ancestor comes back. So Uncle Jorge died 6 months ago. Well, on the Day of the Dead, they go to the cemetery. They play his favorite music. They bring him his favorite cigar and bathe his tomb in his favorite cigar smoke, because he's there. He can smell it. You bring his favorite bottle of tequila, and he can absorb it into his spirit. So the dead are not gone. They are still there. They still watch over the people. They still protect little children, and they are there to welcome those who die. And so the world of the dead and the world of the living are not separate entities, but they merge into one. So the Mexican culture has accepted the presence of death. And of course, in Mexico, death is everywhere. And if it wasn't COVID-19, it would be something else. And so today, even though we are hundreds of years beyond the Aztecs and the Catholic Church is firmly implanted, still this cult of the dead, this acceptance of death is not something to be resisted, but something to be accepted, even necessary that new life can continue. Mexico is today ravaged by death. On the fringes of society, I see every corner, you see young guys sniffing glue to get a high. You see police killing drug dealers, gang members, prostitutes on the street. Their shelf life is pretty limited with all of the diseases circulating, and that is part of the daily life of Mexico. So many young girls can't go to college. They're kicked out by their families, an abusive husband. Well, they can always make a living working the streets. And the police confiscating tons of drugs, as in the picture on the upper left. Drug addiction is everywhere in Mexico. Drug gangs battling for control of turf. When I go to Mexico, I wear my junkiest clothes. I take my cheapest wristwatch, my dirtiest sneakers, and my most ratty looking backpack, because who is going to attack me? They're going to go after the rich tourist with the Rolex watch or the woman with a nice handbag. So street crime is ever present in Mexico. In addition, some 50% of Mexicans today are involved in what is called the informal economy. Whether it is celebrating cooked sweet corn from a giant barrel on a street corner, whether it is the guy on the right, I guess it's a guy, with his hand grinding organ, hoping to get a few coins. These people could not go into lockdown even if they wanted to. If they didn't have their job selling tortillas on the street, selling little cakes, selling postcards, selling bits of candy in the subway stations, if they didn't get enough money for that day, their family would have no supper that evening, which explains why so many young Mexicans are desperate to flee across the border and come to the United States. Even if they're arrested and turned back, or they lose their lives in the deserts of Texas and Arizona, they still risk it. Across the hotel, from the hotel where I stay, there's an abandoned building that was damaged in an earthquake. Well, it's all boarded up, and during the day, it looks like nobody is there. But as soon as it is sunset, I see hundreds of people sneaking in through a hole in the wall to spend the night out of the elements and maybe a little bit safer than sleeping on the streets. They make little fires in a place and cook whatever food they were able to gather. The kids give the coins that they were able to gather, begging on the streets. Poverty is everywhere. Now, these people, even if they wanted to isolate, they had no choice. Guys selling cookies or candies in the subway, young boys selling candy in the middle of traffic. If they have a home to go home to after a day's work, it is very often a mud shack with corrugated iron roof. So poverty to these people is a daily occurrence. People, of course, lament the loss of their boy who's hit by a truck, or their son who is robbed in the subway and knifed, or the kids who are attacked on the streets, the woman who dies in one of these shacks having a baby because she can't afford to go to the doctor. Death is everywhere. And this is not just Mexico. In the favelas of Brazil, in the slums of Africa, even in the poor areas of Thailand and Burma and India, death is a fact of life. And they have developed ideologies, even religious traditions to allow them to continue living and not go into total despair. There is the IMSS, National Health Care. And in Mexico City and other big cities, you see hospitals devoted to COVID-19. But of course, the National Health Care, while it can be good for those who can sign up for it, is largely beyond the reach of the average Mexican. They do have several free clinics, but the lines can be astronomical to get in. The picture on the left shows me sitting in a park, and there's a white tent-looking building behind it. And that was one of the places where, when I was there, they were doing free COVID testing. Well, the problem was, even if a Mexican went in there and was tested and was positive, there was really nothing they could do. And so they just didn't tell anybody. They went about their job, selling tortillas on the streets, going to construction, going back to their family, and spreading the disease. Many people turn to folk remedies. You have the famous botanicas, which are all over Mexico, which are folk remedies, where an Aztec-styled priest or priestess would burn incense, say prayers, give you a candle to light, say a prayer, or drink a type of tea. Many people had recourse to folk medicine. But it was the cult, the ancient cult with deep roots in Aztec religion of Nuestra Señora de la Santa Muerta, who emerged from the slums and from the cult movements to become a major religious phenomenon in Mexico, and as we're going to see, the United States and around the world, where the famous correderos, the botanicas, started featuring Our Lady of Holy Death as one of their major responses to the growing pandemic of COVID. The people who had recourse to Santa Muerta were the margins of society, the poor and unemployed, who even if they tested themselves and found out that they were positive, could really do nothing about it. So they went to pray to Our Lady of Holy Death. Well, Our Lady of Holy Death had long been venerated by refugees and homeless who faced a constant possibility of death. Many gays and prostitutes would have a little statue of Our Lady of Holy Death, or a medal, or even a tattoo on their bodies, asking Our Lady of Holy Death to protect them, and at least if they were killed, they knew that their life was not in vain because it would protect other people. Mentally ill and sick, mental hospitals, while not open and officially, would have little statues and shrines to Holy Death. Nurses and health workers constantly opposed to death, and especially COVID-19, even those professional people trained in Western medicine very often would have a holy card of holy death tucked in their wallet or their purse. Bartenders and waiters who had no choice but to go to work, or they would earn no money because they were dependent on tips. And so, even at the worst period of COVID, they had no choice but to go to work. Taxi drivers and cleaners, single mothers and orphans, all venerated Our Lady of Holy Death to please protect me. And it gave them consolation that even if I die, I know that my life will have served a good purpose. Masks were made, embroidered with pictures of Santa Muerta. On the right, you'd go into a botanica and the woman would be selling statues and candles with Santa Muerta. One of the cards that you would buy of Santa Muerta in Spanish, but it means, today, Our Lady of the Holy Death says to you, the coronavirus will not touch your house nor your family. You are protected with the precious blood of Christ. Keep your faith and do not doubt the protective powers of holy death. So here again, for people who could not go to hospitals, people who could not mask and stay away from work, which were the majority of the Mexicans, holy death gave them consolation. Masks were being made with pictures of holy death. Here again, this was another way for women to make money and hopefully support their family. Many of these masks were hand embroidered and they would sell them at a decent price. And they always had masks with skeletal figures of Our Lady of Holy Death. Botanicas had candles, had statues wrapped in plastic to celebrate the cult of Our Lady of Holy Death. This is a translation of one of the signs, Holy Death, Lady of the Light, not the Holy Lady of Death and Suffering, but the Lady of Light, of optimism. Before God and before you I kneel so that you intercede for me and for the entire world, to eliminate all evil, virus, or bacteria. Cleanse with your purifying mantle. Lady, listen to my pleas. Help and give bread and shelter to those who need it, and seek you in strength. Lady of the end times, protect us so that we are not infected and do not infect those we love. Sweep COVID-19 away from our path and grant us shelter, food, and support. I ask you to never fail me. Amen. And so for the people who had no actual way of protecting themselves, Our Lady of Holy Death would protect them. And if they did die, they knew that it was for a good purpose. Now, Our Lady of Holy Death started moving out from the little botanicas tucked away in a side street, or a holy person who would venerate the cult. And it started achieving a certain notoriety in Mexico and eventually around the world. For example, the Santa Biblia de la Santa Muerta, the Holy Bible of Holy Death. Now, this was very important because as long as a cult of Our Lady of Holy Death remained a popular folk religion, You had a little shrine here. You might see a statue there. Of course, it was banned by the official Catholic Church. But among drug dealers and nurses and hospital workers and poor people, it was very common to see a statue of Our Lady of Death, or they'd have even a tattoo on their arm, or they would have a little holy card in their pocket. But once the cult of Our Lady of Holy Death started becoming more and more popular in Mexico, it entered what is called the period of institutionalization. Max Weber, the great father of the sociology of religion, wrote that every religion begins as a little cult off in a corner somewhere, just like Jesus' cult. I mean, persecuted by everybody, looked down by the sophisticated Romans, rejected and persecuted by Jews and pagans alike. But eventually, Catholicism, Christianity emerged and became a major religious movement. The first step in becoming a major world religious movement was the writing of a holy book, whether it's the Jewish Bible, the Christian Bible, the Hindu Gita, the Quran, the Book of Mormon, or in this case, the Holy Bible of Santa Muerta. You need to organize your teachings. What do you believe? What are the rituals? What are the prayers? You had to get professional leaders. These are people who knew the cult. They knew how to preach. They could gather a following, have a little religious service in their living room for the followers of this cult. You had to have certain leaders, authoritative teachers, to know what is true religion and what is false. Gradually, when you got more and more people in your living room could handle, you moved into a formal house of worship. Well, of course, it might be just a storefront somewhere or a hall that you rented on a weekly or daily basis. Then public statues of Our Lady of Holy Death started appearing on street corners, with people burning candles in front of them, no longer hidden away in your wallet or your purse or your home, but going public. People started publishing books, tracts, flyers, publicizing the religion. And eventually the mass media would get involved, and there would be some type of television program. So what began as a tiny underground, hidden away cult among drug dealers and people constantly facing death emerged, and it became a major religious movement. The first formal temple was in Tepito in Mexico City, which was established in the year 2001. On the left, you see Our Lady of Holy Death in a beautiful white dress and a white hat with a veil on it, holding a bouquet of white flowers with statues all around her, but yet her head is a skeleton. And you see people bringing in their statues of Our Lady of Holy Death and asking the statue in the temple to bless their statue, which they would then put in their homes. In especially dangerous areas, such as the one on the right, look at the buildings behind, the front door is boarded up, but yet on the street, you have somebody putting up a statue of Our Lady of Holy Death, with a table in front of her for people to leave offerings or light candles. But look at her beautiful gown. Our Lady of Holy Death is not someone evil to be feared, coming along with a sword to strike you dead. She is dressed in a beautiful robe. So death is not a fearful thing. Death is everywhere, but it serves a positive function. It is necessary that new life can continue. In Cancun, not far from my little hostelito, there was a woman, Yuri Mendez, who opened up in her living room her own temple. Outside of it, she had a little garden where people would put up statues of our holy death. Now, these are not fearsome. The picture on the right where you see Our Lady of Holy Death standing there, and a little fish pond with flowers and trees around it. It's almost like a festival occasion. And there you see the Yuri Mendez in her living room with all of the statues of Holy Death, beautifully dressed. Now, she is called by many people a curadera, comes from the word to cure. Another translation is a witch. Here again, she was a self-proclaimed witch or curadera, or you could say priestess in the temple in Cancun. Here again, you see the statue, and in front of it, there's a little sign that says Mother Death. And this was the fertility pool, because death was necessary that fertility would remain on the earth. Think of the Aztecs, to make the sun come up, to make the crops be fruitful, to make the king victorious in war. Women would go to her to pray to get pregnant. And this is the Capella della Dolce Madre, the chapel of the sweet mother. So to have a skeletal figure dressed in beautiful finery, but to be the mother who brings new life. Well, many people have started discovering this movement. And the picture in the right, you see the priestess with no doubt a European tourist, and he's receiving books and pictures and other items on this very strange cult, which even Europeans are starting to discover. The Templo de Santa Muerta International. It is now starting to go international. And this is one of the statues in Mexico City showing a giant statue of Our Lady of Holy Death in a courtyard with murals on the wall. And you see the guy standing or kneeling and praying to Holy Death. This is presided over by Doña Queta, and you see her in her temple with statues of Holy Death. Now, Mexicans have brought this movement to the United States. And don't forget, the Mexicans in the United States are very often in a similar situation with the Mexicans back in Mexico. Drug dealers, agricultural workers, construction workers, workers in the kitchens of restaurants, hotel workers. If they don't go to work, they don't get paid. Many of them are illegal. And so they can't even go to a hospital, even if it offers free medical care, or they are afraid. So the cult is very popular among Mexicans in the United States and even in Europe. This is the sanctuary I visited in La Merced, which is the Santuario Nacional de Ancho de la Santa Muerta, the national sanctuary of the Angel of Holy Death. It was an interesting place. The picture on the left shows an actual Catholic church, and there was a Catholic priest who I understood was expelled from the Catholic Church, but he still comes there and says the Catholic Mass. And interestingly, if you look close inside, on the right-hand side of this little archway, you see a statue of Holy Death. Right behind her is the American flag. Since so many immigrant workers, drug dealers, cartel workers spend as much time in the United States as they do in Mexico, the movement is considered typical to both United States and to Mexico. Now, between the two archways, the one where the altar is, where the priest says Mass, and the railing, and the other half arch on the right, you see a little triangular shelf. That is filled with little baby dolls, all dressed up in their finery, silk gowns and ribbons and bows, because death leads to new life. Just like the Aztecs said, that if you don't have death, you cannot have fertility of the land. The sun will not rise. Death is necessary for new life. Catholics, with their cult of death, well, the dead don't really leave. They are still here, influencing the affairs of this world. And so death and life are related. They are bound to each other. Now, the picture on the left shows the Catholic altar where the priest says Mass. Now, through the well-lit archway on the right is a sanctuary devoted to Our Lady of Holy Death. And you see the statue in her beautiful blue gowns, surrounded by angels and flowers and candles. And there is a bell at the top. And when I was at Mass at the church part, I would see people running in from the street to make an offering or to say a prayer. And almost like in a Buddhist temple, when you go in, you ring the bell to attract her attention. You say your prayer, and then you ring the bell again as you leave. Now, this is in the Merced is a somewhat safe area, although you have to be careful about going around that area. This is the outside of the Santuario. And on the right, you see the statue of Our Lady of Death, and you see the priest who is saying Mass. They're very traditionally Catholic, although from what I heard, he has been expelled from the Catholic Church, and a new group of Catholic priests who have embraced the cult of Our Lady of Holy Death have reconstituted themselves as the Iglesia Católica Apostólica Tradicional. And this is the apostolic traditional Catholic Church. And they have their own bishop, their own hierarchy, and they staff more and more of these little churches, which are no longer so little and which are growing up. And so it is becoming rather organized. And this church now, it has churches and priests in both Mexico and the United States. And it has gained legal recognition by the Mexican government in the year 2003 as a major Mexican religious movement. So here again, inside the church, you see the little sanctuary with the baby dolls all dressed up. On the right, there was a statue in the church with the multicolored gay and lesbian transgender flag, because gays and lesbians and transgender people are very often the victims of crime in Mexico and are not accepted by many people. In the middle at the bottom, you see one of the big drug dealers who made a donation to the church and has his picture with two statues of Our Lady of Holy Death. Now, just outside the church, I found a newly built little street corner chapel with a Lady of Holy Death in blue with flowers and a table for offerings and candles. At the bottom on the left is another little outdoor shrine just outside the church. Well, when I took that picture, there were some guys in the area and they thought I was maybe a policeman or something checking on the drug dealers who frequented that church. And needless to say, I snapped my picture and left the area as quickly as I could. Now, the movement is also going global. You still have the majestic Catholic Cathedral in Mexico City. But according to the Associated Press, in 2017, the bishops of the United States and Mexico soundly condemned the cult of Our Lady of Holy Death as being not in accordance with Catholic teaching. Nonetheless, it continues to grow in heavily Mexican areas such as Jackson Heights, just a couple blocks from where I live. It is become very present. Jackson Heights has a very large Mexican population who deal in office cleaning, selling in the subway station, construction, prostitution, all kinds of jobs. Many of them don't have any legal status here. So Jackson Heights was ravaged by COVID-19. The top on the right, you see the Elmhurst Hospital, a couple blocks from where I live, was the #1 site for COVID care in New York. In fact, Elmhurst was ground zero for the COVID in New York. I've caught it twice, even though I am vaccinated and have boosters, but still it is everywhere you go, in the subways. In fact, churches and places nearby during the height of the pandemic were literally giving out boxes of food so you wouldn't have to go to a grocery store. You could isolate yourself in the home. But my neighbor who cleans offices at night in Manhattan had to take the subway. She had to work in her office. She had to interact with people. The doorman in my building is a Hispanic. He has no choice but to do his job. So it was only inevitable that Our Lady of Holy Death would make herself felt in Elmhurst. Los Angeles had its own shrine to Our Lady of Holy Death, where you see outdoor shrines. Los Angeles is 50% Hispanic, majority Mexican. So it's inevitable that they would start building shrines in the major American cities devoted to Our Lady of Holy Death. Santa Muerta podcast given by the New Orleans Chapel of the Santísima Muerta, the Most Holy Death. This is an international Santa Muerta movement. BBC News has covered it. World History Association in July 2021 had a conference devoted to among the COVID refugees in Cancun, given by myself. And so it is entering not only into the big cities of the United States and Mexico, but it is gaining recognition, not only by the Mexican government, which recognizes it as a legal religious movement, but podcasts, websites, and courses and lectures being given at scholarly organizations such as the World History Association. Books are being written. Tracy Rowland's Santa Muerta, the history, rituals, and magic of Our Lady of Holy Death. And in fact, has a website devoted to it, describing its history, what it teaches, what its goal is. Conferences in Groningen in Holland, reflections on the first academic conference on Santa Muerta. Miracles of Death, the Santa Muerta cult in Mexico. So the cult is gaining an international recognition. In fact, one book wrote that it is the fastest growing new religious movement in North America and throughout the Americas. One estimate was 10 to 12 million people globally now consider themselves followers of Our Lady of Death. Now, that doesn't mean they have an ID card, but it means that even if they are a good Catholic on Sunday or a good Protestant, they do have a little shrine to Our Lady of Holy Death. R. Andrew Chestnut wrote his famous book devoted to death. Thomas Power, the Santa Muerta, a brief introduction to Santa Muerta. A whole category of literature is being devoted to what Chestnut called the fastest growing religious movement in the Americas. So from the World History Association, American Academy of Religion, World Council of Churches, YouTube movies, Wall Street Journal articles are beginning to pay attention to this new religious movement, firmly rooted in Aztec theology, absorbed by the Catholic Church of Mexico, and today making itself very relevant in the age of COVID. Accept death. Do not resist it. Death will always be with us. It is necessary, and it serves the purpose of ensuring new life. So this is an example of one religion which has moved from the margins to mainstream. And this is not the only example of this proliferation of new religious movements today. Kabbalah and other Jewish magic and superstitious movements are moving out of the ghetto and into popular awareness. The evangelicals with their Pentecostals with speaking in tongues, once again, has entered the mainstream of Christian movements. African traditional religions are having a renaissance, whereas Africa has traditionally been marked as Muslim North, Christian South. More and more Africans are rediscovering their ancient African traditions. Fairy mythology of Northern Europe, the various Viking religions, old Germanic religious traditions are enjoying a renewed interest, especially by young people. The New Age movement was very important in bringing the attention of these new religious movements, these old religious movements, to the attention of especially young people. Well, this has been marked by a radical decline in religiosity in the United States and around the world. Beginning in 1960, considered the high point of religious membership and attendance, over 75% in the United States, is now on a rapid decline. In fact, many people say that there are more ex-Catholics than there are Catholics in the United States. In Mexico, the Catholic Church is rapidly declining, and these people are moving to new religious movements, such as Our Lady of Holy Death. Nonetheless, movements continue to grow. looking forward to the year 2060, Islam is the fastest growing world religion, followed by Christianity and Hindus. Jews are slowly growing, Buddhists are declining, folk religions are growing. So the future is going to be still dominated by Christians and Muslims and Hindus, and Judaism is holding its own pretty well. But these new religious movements are growing in strength. Even within Muslim, Christian, Hindu, and Jewish religions, new religious tendencies are gradually reinterpreting what it means to be a Jew, a Hindu, a Christian, or a Muslim. Many evangelicals and Pentecostals would not consider Mormons and Catholics and Greek Orthodox as authentic Christians. In fact, the Mormons consider themselves the only true Christians. And so even within Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, and Judaism, there is a lot of religious ferment. So that brings us to an end to our discovery of one of the newest and most exciting new religious movements which emerged over the centuries and has really burst onto the religious scene because of COVID-19. Our Lady of Holy Death has grown from a backroom cult to a major religious movement, giving a very interesting and what many people consider a very satisfying approach to death. Now, in the West and in America, dealing with death is a major issue for hospital workers. People are specially trained. How do you prepare an old person, a young person, a person in their prime with breast cancer? How do you talk about death? Our Lady of Holy Death offers a solution that death is part of life. It's not something to be feared, to be fled from, to be conquered, but to be embraced, to be accepted. Of course, you're going to go to the doctor and do what you can. You can go to a doctor if you can afford it in Mexico, but yet death is part of the cycle of human life. Death is part of life. So this is Dr. Ronald Brown. You can contact me at ronbrownmedia@gmail.com if you'd like. Once again, standing in front of my hostelito in Cancun, the very place which encouraged me and inspired me to do a study on how different religious traditions are dealing with COVID. I did a similar program on France, on how the French were dealing with COVID, and another one on how the United States is dealing with it from the medical perspective. And so COVID is a major event in not only medical history in the United States, but also religious history. So thank you very much for joining me today. And I hope to see you sometime in the near future for another exciting lecture. So this is Dr. Ronald Brown logging off. Thank you for joining me today, and have a good time confronting COVID and prepare well for the next pandemic. Thank you again. Bye-bye.